As many of you know, the business model that I practice on Turo is the economical car business model. This means that my fleet, for the most part, consists of cars like Toyota Yaris's, Honda Fits, Hyundai Elantras, and Mazdas. Normal cars that aren't flashy or fancy, but the average Joe is going to be able to rent them because they're affordable and they need that car to get from point A to point B. More often than not, this is because a guest has their car in the shop, their car is broken, or they just don't have a car for whatever reason. But one business model that I also take part in fact, as we see here today, about 15% of my fleet consists of cars in this model, and that is the high perceived value business model. A quick overview of this strategy is basically buying cars that have a high value perception. These cars look expensive. At one point in time, they probably were expensive, but because of poor depreciation, you can buy these cars today used with a really great price, but people think they're still expensive, and so they rent them for a high price. Today, I'm going to talk about what this business model is, how it works and what it means, and most importantly, how you could potentially implement this in your own fleet. But before we dive into that, I do want to remind you guys that I have a course called the Car Sharing Masterclass, and we are actually preparing for our 3.0 release of the course, which will have a ton of new additions, including things like direct rentals, how to navigate the updated Turo system, and tons of documents and resources that you can use with your own fleet. Whenever this is released at the beginning of August, we are going to be increasing the price of the course. And so if you're interested in checking out the Car Sharing Masterclass, now is your time to do so at a low price. We even have a coupon code where you can get $100 off by using the code OFFER100, and we offer a robust 30-day money-back guarantee. That way you can give the course a try at no risk to you. If you want to check it out, click the link down in the description below. Now, what is high perceived value? This is a term that I've been using since 2021 when I bought my Maserati Ghibli, and truthfully, I think there's no better example of a high perceived value car than the Ghibli. The Maserati Ghibli is a Maserati, and if you were to ask someone what car they drove, or if someone was to ask you that question and you were to answer Maserati, I think they would be impressed. The car looks sharp, it has Maserati branding and clout, but oh wait, these cars are dirt cheap. You can buy newer, lower mileage Maserati Ghiblis for around 40 grand, but you can buy older, higher mileage ones for well under 20. And when it comes to used vehicles, these cars are priced well below average for the segment of car and have some of the worst depreciation in the car market. And while depreciation is something that you should absolutely have top of mind if you're someone who's buying a car, where depreciation can actually play in your favor is by buying cars that have already depreciated, and thus you get a great bang for your buck. Because at the end of the day, while a Maserati Ghibli has terrible depreciation, Turo renters don't care. Because even though this car is cheap to buy, what Turo renters see is a Maserati brand. Because for example, if you look at Turo and search Maserati Ghibli, they're renting for between $80 and $175 per day in different markets. And as I mentioned a moment ago, Turo renters don't take into account depreciation whenever they're renting a car. They take into account style, branding, potential clout, and wow factor. And that's where cars with high perceived value can become a great moneymaker. Now, really quickly before we move on, I want to emphasize I am by no means telling you that you should go out and buy a Maserati Ghibli instead of a Honda Accord. At the end of the day, whenever we talk about the composition of a Turo fleet, the majority of your cars should be made up of cars like a Honda Accord. Ones that may be a bit boring, may not have the highest level of ROI that you could possibly get, but they are cars that are stable, reliable, and just consistent. And while I don't know that I would make up my fleet of $20,000 Honda Accords, I do think normal, boring cars is what most fleets should be made up of. For example, the cars that I buy. But I do think that high perceived value vehicles can make up a portion of a Turo fleet and do really well. So as I've stated, a high perceived value car is a car that looks expensive, feels expensive, rents for a high daily rate, but all things considered, the car is quite cheap. But the next question is, how do you actually find high perceived value cars? Well, the first thing to know is that high perceived value cars are going to be cars that depreciate poorly. These are cars that are going to lose anywhere between 40 to 70% of their value in the first 5 to 7 years, and these are cars that are gold mines for this segment of car. But if it wasn't clear already, do not under any circumstances buy these cars new, because that's how you lose a ton of money. Where you can actually end up gaining from the depreciation is buying them after they've depreciated, not before. For example, let's look at a Lincoln Navigator, which I think is another great example of this. I have a Lincoln Navigator in my fleet, and it consistently rents for over $100 per day, but sometimes it goes as high as $150. Mine is a 2018, it had an MSRP of just above 98 grand, but I bought it just 5 years later in 2023 for 37 grand. And if you look online, you can find plenty of Navigators with the previous body style for around $40,000 or below. And the cool thing about the Navigator specifically, or other large SUVs that also have poor depreciation, is that they also qualify for Section 179, which is a great tax play as well. But if the Navigator or a large SUV isn't your style, looking at luxury segments is a great place to start for high perceived value cars. For example, a Lexus is not a good example of a high perceived value, and that's because Lexuses hold their value really well. But a Mercedes vehicle, on the other hand, not so well. For example, let's look at an older Lexus IS250 compared to a Mercedes C250. The Lexus IS250 may rent for $60 to $70 per day, which is pretty good, while a Mercedes C250 also rents for about $60 to $70 per day. However, a Mercedes is literally half the price of an IS250. Again, I'm not insinuating that a Mercedes is always going to be a better bet than a Lexus for a Turo fleet, because Lexus obviously has big benefits associated with that brand, like reliability and stability, for example. But what I am saying from a value perception standpoint, people think the Mercedes is on equal, if not higher ground than the Lexus, despite the fact that the Lexus is very literally twice as expensive. And thus, even though the Mercedes is half the price, it's renting for the same amount. It all comes down to value perception. People think Mercedes is a much more expensive brand than it oftentimes is. And there are, of course, high-end, very expensive Mercedes out there, even used ones. I think the C-Class is a perfect example of a really great bang for your buck car that's cheap but still looks expensive. There are a bunch of different cars that you could look at that are potentially great high perceived value finds. But here are some that I have specifically looked into that I know would be good ones. The Maserati Ghibli, Lincoln Navigator, Mercedes, specifically the C-Class, a BMW, specifically lower end ones like the 3 Series, and Cadillac, specifically the Escalade but also the CTS. And if you're looking at the CTS, I would look at getting the V6 because it is more reliable. These are cars that can be extremely high earners, especially if you buy them at the right price. And so whenever you look at the money invested compared to the money make, they are great buys. But one thing to keep in mind is that high perceived value cars can oftentimes come at a cost, because unfortunately these cars are more often than not the most reliable. For example, the Maserati Ghibli is a car that has notoriously poor reliability ratings, and while we own this car with no issues, we do also have our Lincoln Navigator, which had a number of major repairs in the first year. Even more so than buying economical cars, if you're someone who is going to go this high perceived value route, you want to make sure that you do an extremely thorough PPI and that you do research on what cars to avoid versus which ones to buy. Because, for example, I think a high perceived value car that I would not buy is something like a Jaguar. This car would no doubt rent well, but an older Jaguar is a disaster waiting to happen. So there are a lot of high perceived value cars out there, but not all of them are going to be worth buying. And in order to determine if a car is actually worth buying as a high perceived value car, as I mentioned a moment ago, more often than not, these are going to be luxury vehicles, and they're going to be luxury vehicles that have depreciated a significant amount in a short period of time. And so the best way to gauge if a car that you're looking at fits into this category is to see what the car is selling for today, what it sold for whenever it was new, and what this car is renting for. And then you can compare this to similar cars in that same price point. For example, if you're looking at a Maserati Ghibli, you wouldn't want to look at that car and compare it to a Ferrari or a Porsche. You would want to compare it to a different car in the same price range, like the Honda Accord that we mentioned earlier. And this will give you a really good gauge on the ROI of that vehicle and whether or not it is truly a high perceived value find that is warranting high perceived value prices. Like always, you guys, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, comments, if you have anything to add, I would love to hear it, so make sure to leave a comment down below. And while you guys are at it, make sure to hit the like button, hit that subscribe button, and hit the notification bell, and I will see you guys in the next video.